Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the third session of the BU Wheelock Space Office webinar series, Research That Matters, Insights from Community Engaged Scholarship. My name is Kara Mataliano, and I am the Assistant Director of the Office of Strategic Partnerships and Community Engagement here at BU Wheelock. This series was created to showcase the impactful research of BU Wheelock faculty and their partners from other leading research institutions. Through a series of compelling conversations, these sessions aim to translate cutting-edge scholarship into accessible, practical knowledge, fostering stronger connections between researchers, policymakers, and community practitioners. In this session, we're so grateful to learn from two incredible researchers and people, Dr. Elizabeth Bettini, Associate Professor of Special Education at BU Wheelock, and Dr. Tuan Nguyen, Associate Professor of Educational Leadership and Policy Analysis at the University of Missouri. Drawing on two of their recent studies, they will share valuable insights into pressing challenges and critical trends shaping the special education workforce today. Now, I'm also thrilled to introduce Jessica Wong, BU's Director of Federal Relations. With nearly 8 years of experience on Capitol Hill, Jessica brings deep expertise in bridging research and policy. Her understanding of the federal landscape makes her the perfect person to guide this important conversation. I'm excited to hand it over to Jessica and our panelists to kick things off and begin.
Thanks so much, Kara. Really glad to be here with you all today, and thank you for tuning in. Again, my name is Jessica Wong. I'm BU's Director of Federal Relations, and I'm going to actually here to moderate this excellent conversation, and I will turn it over to Dr. Bettini to introduce herself.
Hi, I'm Liz Bettini. I'm an associate professor in the special education program at BU Wheelock, affiliated with the Wheelock Education Policy Center. And I study factors that shape the special education teacher workforce.
Hi, I'm Tuan Nguyen. I am an associate professor of educational leadership and policy analysis at the University of Missouri. I mainly study the teacher labor market.
Great. Well, jumping right in, I'm wondering if you both can just share a little bit more about the two studies that we're going to be talking about today, and just providing a brief overview.
Sure, we can definitely do that. So the first study is looking at the diversity of the special educator workforce. So we know that teacher diversity is teacher quality. Teachers of color are critical for student learning experience, and yet the vast majority of special education teachers are white. And the number of special ed teachers of color isn't representative of the students that they serve. So in this first study, published in Exceptional Children, we are looking at sort of the number of special ed teachers of color, how they are representative of or not representative of the students that they serve. And what we see that even prior to the current Trump administration and the efforts they have taken to, sort of negate the, equity, diversity work, that we don't have the necessary workforce that's needed to serve our students with disability of color. And in the second study, and it's very much related to this, we're thinking, well, who are the people who are serving our students? And what we looked into is the supply of special ed teachers. And we're finding that the number of special ed teachers have been declining at small and medium-sized colleges over time. And this was really not known before. And more sort of disconcerting is that the number of special ed teachers that coming from for-profit institutions are increasing over time. And we'll get into some of the more details of that later on, but they are supplying more and more of our special ed teachers in the last 5 years than ever before.
Great. Well, thank you for that. And I didn't know, Dr. Bettini, if you wanted anything to add, or if everyone had covered most of that.
I think just that these two studies together suggest that we're at like a really critical moment for the special ed workforce. They both point to really urgent challenges in cultivating the special ed workforce that we need to serve all students with disabilities. And both studies are coming out at a time when federal investments in changing those problems and addressing those problems are looking like they're probably going to disappear entirely. And so if we're seeing significant problems, even with the level of federal investment that we've had over the past couple of decades, what's going to happen in the absence of that federal investment?
Appreciate that sort of context as well, sort of meeting the moment of where we are. On that topic, I'm wondering if you can sort of share, I think, Dr. Nguyen, you had mentioned that, this was sort of the second study about, where these special education teachers are getting educated was sort of new, people hadn't realized. And so what was sort of the origins of trying to figure this out? What were the questions that you were seeking to answer, and how did, you come up with it?
Liz, I think I'll let you get started on this one.
Sure. So let's see. I'm trying to remember the origins of the prep paper, and I can't quite remember what was the start of us wanting to ask that question. But for the teacher diversity paper, there's been so much concern about the special education teacher shortage broadly. And I was at a conference where people were talking a lot about those concerns, and someone said, we don't need to worry about recruiting more teachers of color. We just need more teachers, period. And I just thought that was really incorrect based on what I know about the importance of teachers of color for outcomes and experiences of students of color. But also, if we're pouring all of this policy attention and investment into addressing the shortage, shouldn't we do that in ways that address the most urgent shortages, which include special ed teachers of color? Shouldn't we do that in ways that are more inclusive, more welcoming of a broader population of special ed teachers than we have included or welcomed before? And so it really made me wonder about the ways that people were framing the shortage and thinking about addressing it. And it also made me wonder, like, we have had some policy attention at the state level and at the federal level on diversifying the workforce. It made me wonder, like, are we doing enough? Collectively, are all of the initiatives that we have running, are they collectively making a difference in the diversity of the workforce? And so then I went to Tuan and suggested that I had this really ambitious idea that I thought would be very easy. And Tuan was like, no, it's very hard. I said, could we look at trends in changes over time in the number of special ed teachers of color, in the number of students with disabilities of color, and project into the future, how long would it take for us to reach parity? How long would it take for us to have a special ed workforce that is representative of the population of students with disabilities? And Tuan told me that was a lot harder than I thought it was. Tuan,
Yeah, so I can talk about that a little bit. So she literally sent me like a chat message saying, "Hey Tuan, can we just do this really quickly? This should be simple, right?" And I said, "Well, Liz, it should be, but like there are a number of other things that I think we have to, we have to account for, like the number of people entering the profession, the number of people who choose to become teachers, how long they stay, the size of the reserve pool, meaning teachers who are certified but they didn't teach at all, or they taught for 1 year and then left, and then thinking about retirement and a number of different things. So there are a number of places where you lose teachers, and places where teacher can rejoin. So really, it is complicated thinking about the entire picture. So I think I sat down, I cleared my schedule for 2 days, and I work on it for a day and have literally nothing else. And I'm just like, all right, let me see if I can come up with a way to think about this problem and where we can have some real data so that we can actually examine this, or where we have to make some assumptions about the workforce in order to make some estimates. So that's what the estimator that we have in that paper is for. It's like, hey, what can we actually do to examine the educator workforce? And for the other paper, part of the origin of that paper, looking at the teacher prep, is that over the last several years, we've heard a lot about 8+ Texas teachers of tomorrow, and how they are a large producer of teachers in Texas, and a number of those teachers are special ed teachers. And we have no idea how effective these teachers are. We do know that their training does not include some of the things that we usually see at, teacher prep programs or even most of the alt-cert programs where they have, hands-on training, they've been in a classroom, all of this is online. So it raises this concern like, hey, who are training our teachers, particularly our special ed teachers? How has that grown over time? And so we examined this using two different nationally representative data sets, and it was really surprising to us that how this has grown over time, and that there's been very little coverage of this in the news and known by other researchers.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And thank you for sort of deep diving into some of the work that you've been doing and the origins of it. I think it's wonderful. And I actually just wanted to take a little step back because I'm wondering if you could tell us about how you two started to work together. I'm assuming, Dr. Bettini didn't just message and say, hello, I would love for you just to tell me
Run
how
this
we can do this.
analysis.
Exactly. So I'm wondering how you two, connected and started collaborating.
Yeah, so it was I checked of 2019 that we first got together, and I think we knew sort of each other a little bit beforehand, but really we know a couple of other people, Krista Redding and Ellie Gilmore, and we were all interested in looking at the special education teacher workforce. And we were like, hey, why don't we just do this one paper where, we have good data and hasn't been examined that well. Um, that's how we started. And I think we enjoy working with each other because we have published 5 or 6 papers together. In fact, just this morning, we have just submitted another paper together, just literally minutes ago, examining the special educated workforce, an extension of the one of these papers. So we have just really enjoyed working with each other over the last several years. Um, and what's interesting is that it started out as just one question, but then it led to another question. And then somebody said, hey, what about X, Y, and Z? And one of the things I'll say that I really appreciate working with Dr. Bettini here is that she's very, very optimistic and very positive about the work that we're doing. So sometimes I'm just like, I have this idea. I'm like, hey, let's see how far we can go with this idea. And Liz would be like, that's great. Let's see how far we can stretch that. And then it turns out that ends up being like, at least one paper, if not 2 papers.
Right back at you, Tuan. I feel like when we have research team meetings, it's like a little like cheerleading squad. Like it's always really, yeah.
I love that. It sounds like such a great collaborative sort of partnership that you've all developed over the years. And I will just say, congratulations. And for everyone tuning in, breaking news that you all submitted a new paper just today. So congrats. But, one of the things that you had sort of actually already started talking about, which I'm hoping you can sort of dive in a little bit more, is talking about that sort of research process. As you had 2 studies, it sounds like it was very easy to sort of go and sort of continue to pose questions about all the things that you wanted to discover. But are these things that these 2 studies, did you develop them simultaneously? It sounds like maybe one was sort of thought up first, and then it just sort of spurred more questions and led to more, data and research that led to more studies. But could you sort of talk about that sort of process a little bit more?
I feel like there's always an iterative process of thinking about like what are the most urgent questions facing the field that we want to be exploring and answering for policymakers and leaders. And I think there's always kind of that in conversation with the data sources that we have access to and the methodologies that our team is skilled in. And kind of putting those 2 things in conversation with one another. There are a number of questions that we'd love to ask, but we don't have the right data for. And so in those cases, we think about, grant writing, et cetera. But I feel like it's always like an iterative process of identifying what are the key questions, what are we equipped to answer as a team, given our data sets and our skills.
I think that's right. And sort of to add to that, one of the things that we have been, I think, pretty good at doing is thinking about what are the big picture questions, right? And how we can potentially answer that. So for example, nobody had prior to us examined how No Child Left Behind had affected special ed teacher workforce. Right. And that's pretty surprising seeing how that's basically 20 years ago, but nobody has done it. Nobody examined the effect of the IDEA on special ed teacher workforce. And we were like, well, should we not examine this? Because these are huge federal initiatives, right? That affected so many teachers and so many students. We should know what effects they've had on students and teachers, you know? So with the data source that we have, we were able to answer how has this affected teacher working conditions. Now, we're not able to answer, say, how this has affected students just because the data do not exist and, you know, did not and do not exist so where we can answer those questions. But sort of this leads us into thinking about how we apply for more grants or future projects, thinking of, hey, what are we able to answer? What are we not able to answer? What resources do we need in order to build and move forward?
Yeah. And to that point, I want to, there's two things I want to build on that. One is that part of what's been so exciting about this collaboration is that traditionally in special ed, there's been very limited use of state longitudinal data systems or federal data collection efforts. So there are so many incredible data sources that have traditionally been collected by the federal government that we make use of in these papers. The National Center for Education Statistics collects most of them, such as the Schools and Staffing Survey, the National Teacher and Principal Survey. And traditionally in special ed, those have not gotten a lot of play and have not been used to answer many of the questions that they can be used to answer. So one of the things that's really cool to me about this partnership is working with people who not only have access to those data sets, but have the skills to kind of take full advantage of them, which I did not develop in my preparation program, in my doctoral training. The other thing I'll say is just the incredible affordances of the data sets that we get from NCES. They allow us to ask and answer nationally representative questions about what is happening with teachers across the entire United States. And in doing so, they allow us to draw national inferences, much more robust inferences. They allow us to do so without spending a ton of time and energy on data collection. So I have collected a national survey before. It was so much work, and it was doing a lot of things that are not necessarily the best use of my time and skills. So I was spending a lot of time, for example, calling district administrators saying, please send this survey out to your teachers, right? That's not the best use of my time and energy. As someone with a PhD in special education, the fact that the federal government collects that data, does that kind of legwork, allows us to answer a lot of questions much more efficiently, much more effectively than we could do if we had to collect those data on our own.
I think that's right. And it's sort of we are, I think we're going to talk about this in a little bit, but to reiterate Liz's point that so much of this work could not be done if we did not have those data sources. So in thinking about how the Trump administration is, you know, canceling these contracts and the work that NCES and IES, there is this big question of, hey, how are we going to be able to address these questions at the national level and even at the state level when we don't collect these data anymore? And essentially, we're going to be going blind over the next few years, and it's going to be up to each individual state or even district to figure out how do we examine these issues, how do we address them from a systematic perspective. I think that's going to be really challenging.
And I just wanted to jump in for folks. I know we're throwing around a number of alphabet soup. So I just want to break down some of the ones that you all mentioned. So IES stands for Institute of Education Sciences. So that's within the Department of Education. You mentioned the National Center for Education Statistics, NCES. And then the last one you also mentioned is IDEA, which stands for Individuals with Disabilities Education App. So just breaking that down for folks turning in that might not have.
Sorry.
Thank you. You're good.
Do that. Yeah.
It happens, but I appreciate you sort of mentioning that, and I think we can talk about that a little bit later in our discussion. But also just wanted to bring up with one of the studies, you know, you talk about, I think in the first one, about sort of teachers of color and special education teachers of color. And I know that it seemed like a simple question Dr. Bettini had sort of posed to Dr. Nguyen, but it sounds like it was sort of much more intensive. And I believe you all mentioned when we were sort of chatting that you all had to create this new index to sort of measure some of this. And I know it's a little bit in the weeds and a little wonky, but I thought it wanted to give you all a moment to share a little bit about that because I think it's quite interesting and might be helpful for folks to hear about.
So I can start with the parity index. So the idea is actually pretty straightforward. The parity index is just a way to quickly represent the ratio of the number of uh, special ed teachers of color divided by the number of student of special student with disability over the number of racialized, minoritized student with disability and a number of special ed teachers. So basically, it is a simple number from either 0 to 100% of showing how representative is your workforce in serving the populations that you're working with, right? So this is a parity index that has been used before. What we did was we built upon this index, right? We use this index to figure out, hey, what would be the minimum number of special ed teachers of color that we would need in order to serve the current numbers of students with disability of colors in context with, with the entire population of teachers and colors. So it takes into account not just those, teachers and students of color, but the entire population. And then the parts that we needed to figure out or develop was, hey, how many teachers of colors do we have now? How many of them are special ed teachers? How many of them are coming into and out of the profession? How does this matter in terms of the number of teachers who are enrolling in teacher prep programs? How many of them are actually teaching? How many of them teach right away? How many of them stay, in 3 years or 5 years, right? And then also thinking that how many of them move from gen ed to special ed? How many of them retire? How many of them do X, Y, and Z? So there are a number of factors that went into this. And what we were able to do was to create a fairly, in a way, simple equation that capture all of these ideas in one easy to understand equation. And then with that, though, we were able to project out the number of special ed teachers of color that we would need in order to serve students with the disability of color, and to think about what states and districts can do in order to meet these needs now and in the near future.
So just to build on that, the thing that's really important about the parity index is if you just tell me the proportion of special ed teachers who are teachers of color, I don't know whether that's a representative workforce or not. So for example, if you have 20% special ed teachers of color in Vermont, you might have parity. You might have, overrepresentation of teachers of color. You're doing great, right? If you have 20% in Hawaii, Hawaii is like 70% students of color. You've got vast underrepresentation, right? So just knowing the proportion of special ed teachers who are people of color doesn't tell us whether we have parity with the student population. So by looking at the ratio of special ed teachers of color over the ratio of students with disabilities of color, we're able to get at the degree to which the workforce is representative of the student population. So it allows for comparisons across regions that look very different demographically. It allows for comparisons over time as the student population becomes increasingly diverse.
Yeah, so what we were able to do is look at this sort of nationally, but also by regions, thinking about the South and Midwest, right? So that's one of the things that we explore in the paper. It's like there are specific parts of the country where we're doing much better in terms of providing a representative workforce. There are other parts of the country where we're not doing as well. Overall, though, we only have about a third of the special ed teachers of color workforce that we need in order to have representation at the national level. A third, right? And this is after years and decades of efforts at the national level, at the state level, and district level, trying to get more, first of all, teachers of color to just teach in the first place, but special ed teachers in particular. And this is all before the current administration, where now teacher quality partnership grants and DEI efforts, diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts are all going away. So it brings up this question of, hey, if we aren't able to meet the needs of the students, even when we were doing all these good work and efforts before, how are we going to do that now when we take away all the money, all the support, and all the efforts that have gone to it in the previous decades?
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, Dr. Bettini.
No, I just think that there's two really key implications. One is that we need much more sustained and substantial investment in diversifying the workforce at every single step along the pathway to becoming a teacher, from high school graduation to college entry to choosing a teacher prep program as your major or as your master's degree, through licensure, support, retention, et cetera. So we need much more substantial investment at every step along the pathway. The other key implication, I think, is that in the near future, our students are going to be taught by a predominantly white teacher workforce. It's going to take us decades probably to get to parity. And if we're very, very ambitious, maybe we can get to parity in 10 years, 5 to 10 years, right? But in the meantime, our students are going to be taught by a predominantly white workforce. And so that means that all of our white teachers who are graduating from our teacher preparation programs really urgently need to be prepared for culturally relevant practice so that they are supporting their students appropriately and not harming them.
No, I think that's, very disheartening news that I think sounds like we're going in the wrong direction here, especially with sort of this new administration and their priorities. It seems to sort of be working against, that parity goal. I think you talked about some of those, larger, broader implications that we could be seeing. And so, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit with that reality sort of in place of, we're going to have a white teacher special education workforce. What does this mean for local school districts, administrators, trying to recruit folks or maybe adequately train them to actually be in the classrooms, especially if it sounds like some folks fresh out of these for-profit schools might not have hands-on training. So sort of tying in both studies here, if you could sort of talk about what that means in school districts.
I think what I would love to see is stronger partnership between teacher preparation programs and local school districts. And I think there's a lot of different forms that partnership can take. And there's a lot of examples of really strong partnerships. So just as an example, University of Colorado, Denver has a program called Pathways to Teaching, where they work with local high schools that serve predominantly students of color. They work with local high schools to develop students' interest in potentially becoming a teacher. So high school students take a course where they learn about education and education history and theory of education. And that course counts for college credit if they decide to then go to CU Denver and get a teacher preparation, and be in a teacher preparation program. It also certifies them to be a paraeducator. So they can, and their school district commits to hiring them when they graduate as a paraeducator in that district. So that means they're graduating high school with a license that allows them to immediately get a job in a shortage area within special education. So we also have a shortage of paraeducators. And if they become a paraeducator, they're then eligible for college counseling to help them figure out how they want to, pursue a college degree. So I think we need a lot more partnerships like that at various stages in the pathway to becoming a teacher, that bring people from communities of color into the workforce, invite folks in deliberately, provide them with support, and sustain them over time in a pathway to becoming a teacher.
I think that's right. And then sort of thinking about from a policy perspective, I think there's a lot we need to do. So in particular, just a point of illustration, in 2010, so 15 years ago, about 12% of special education teachers came from just 10 teacher prep programs. So not 10%, but 10 teacher prep programs provide 12% of all special ed teachers in the country in 2010. In 2020, so 5 years ago, those top 10 preparation programs now provide 17.7%. So 1 out of 6 teachers of special ed teachers now come from just 10 programs in the country. Okay. Of those programs, 43% come from for-profit institutions. So the majority of special ed teachers now are being trained at just a handful of teacher prep programs. And of those, they are mostly coming from for-profit institutions where they have very little hands-on training. It's almost all online. We have no idea how effective they are. Preliminary evidence says that they're probably not very effective. And previous work, and I think current work, are showing that they are much more likely to teach half a year or a year and then leave the profession altogether. So what it does is it creates this constant churn, right? So teachers just coming in and out of classroom for our most vulnerable population here, right? And so like the A+ Texas teacher program, they are in a sense too big to fail for Texas. If they lose accreditation, I am not sure where they're going to find, bodies just to be in classroom. And in part, that's why I think that hasn't happened, is they can't afford to fail. So from a policy perspective, we have really have to think about what it means to have a for-profit institution providing teachers in your state. It can be a short-term solution, but within 2-3 years, I think it creates more problems than it purported to solve. And then that's nothing to say of the churn that it creates, and then the level of quality and teaching that we're providing to our students.
There's a trade-off that policymakers are engaged in when they're making these policies. It's, we have multiple problems. We have problem with a shortage, the composition of the workforce. We don't have enough people. We don't have enough people of color. We also have a problem with the stability of the workforce and the effectiveness of the workforce, right? So the folks who we're bringing in are turning over at high rates, and they are insufficiently effective at serving students. And we can have policy solutions that address one of those problems and that make the other ones worse. So for example, when you have really fast track preparation that brings people in without adequate support for them to feel successful, for their students to be successful, it actually exacerbates those other problems. And so what we really need is comprehensive policy solutions that address the shortage, the composition problem, while supporting people to be effective and supporting them to stay over the long term, so we don't have this level of churn.
Mm-hmm.
No, I appreciate that. And I know we're coming up quick and I want to make sure we build in enough time for Q&A. But one thing, just because we've been sort of talking about it throughout this whole conversation, is just talking about the current federal landscape and what you all sort of see as the biggest concerns that you're worried about. I think you talked about funding, you talked about data sets. If you want to, I want to give you all the time to talk through some of the worries that you might have.
So from a very practical perspective, the thing that I think is most threatening for all of this work, particularly around special education teacher, is the data. Like if we are not collecting data on teachers, on students, then we're not going to be able to know what is happening and how policy and practice can be changed in order to make positive effects happen. We just won't be able to. I mean, some of the things that we're talking about right now, we did not know until very recently. And we were only able to know those because these data exist over a long period of time. Right. So when we are canceling, data contracts and we're not collecting data anymore, it won't just be 1 year or 2 year of data that we're missing. We're talking about it's going to take years, even potentially a decade, to get back to where we were in order to have a longitudinal picture of what's going on. So from a very practical standpoint, I think that's the biggest threat. But I think there's even a bigger problem here. I think it's the message we're sending to our society, to our students, to our teachers, to everyday citizen, that this is something that we do not care about anymore. That is no longer a problem, right? So and for teachers, the teacher pay, teacher salary is an issue, right? That we need to raise teacher pay, teacher salary, particularly for special teachers. And if we're saying teachers are not that important, right? That we don't need to diversify the profession, that we don't need to provide support, right? Then what does it mean to be a teacher in this country? And what does that mean for our kids and our kids' kids, right? All of those things matter. So there's the very, immediate threat of not having the data so that we can make decisions. But there's this bigger issue of what does this mean for our society, for our democracy?
Here. I think there's been a long-term trend of devaluation of teachers in U.S. society. I think that's reflected in research that Matt Kraft and Mimi Lyon have done, and I think that the current moment reflects on an escalation of that trend. That I think, independent of the cancellation of teacher quality grants, independent of the cancellation of the data sources, would be incredibly harmful to our efforts to cultivate a strong special ed teacher workforce, a strong teacher workforce in general. And then when you add on top of that, the cancellation of all federal investments focused on the special ed teacher workforce, focused on the teacher workforce broadly, I think we're looking at some real serious harm potentially being done to our schools and to our children.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I want to make sure, I think we have a few questions being posed, so I'll pose those to you all. So first off, how can teacher prep programs integrate culturally relevant education into their curriculum? And what role can public policy play in this?
So I'll say I think traditionally there has been an approach of you know, state departments of education say you need to cover culturally relevant pedagogy, and teacher prep programs add a class that's called like culturally relevant pedagogy, all right? And it kind of sits by itself. And in this class, you learn about explicit instruction, and in this class, you learn about teaching reading, and then in this class, you learn about culturally relevant pedagogy, and they are siloed from one another. But the reality is that when teachers are enacting their practices, they're enacting those in integrated ways. They are using explicit instruction to teach literacy to learners from all sorts of different cultural backgrounds, and they need to know how to do all of those things in an integrated way. And so I think that requires teacher preparation programs to engage in oftentimes really substantive and challenging revisions to their programs to ensure that culturally relevant pedagogy is integrated throughout every course that they teach. We recently engaged in a program revision of the special ed program here at BU, and that was a core focus of what we were doing. And it was a substantial effort on the part of a number of us to revise our courses, our course descriptions, our syllabi, to make sure that all of our courses were aligned around a vision of culturally relevant pedagogy that we could all support and that could be integrated into every single class. I think there is a role for policy in both incentivizing folks to do that. So if you as a state policymaker, when you're doing accreditation, if you're coming and looking for that one course, you're actually incentivizing the wrong thing. What you want to be doing is looking across courses. Is this showing up across courses? There's also, that was expensive. Like we did that with some internal funding from the dean, but that is expensive. And so I think there's also room for policymakers to offer grants for teacher prep programs to engage in that kind of revision. There was another part to your question. I forget it. I had something else I was going to say.
Policy integration. You got it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What role can policy play in this integration?
There you go. I got it.
So I'll just add one piece to that. And one of the things is that I think a lot of us are actually guilty of doing this, is that our classes tend to be very driven by theories. And there's not enough practice and hands-on example of how do you integrate all of these things at the same time, right? And it goes to this question of silo. Like we know we can teach X, and that's fine, but we don't show how X is done in practice. So like being in a classroom, seeing how it's done, talking through examples, like this is how you do it, providing opportunities for students to practice culturally relevant practices, or also classroom management, all of those things are important. And this sort of connects to the point of like, well, what are these online, prep programs are doing? It's like, how are you going to provide hands-on practice when you don't have, that hands-on experience, right? It's like teaching is a craft, right? It's art and it's science. So I think you need very much both to be married well together. You need the theories and you need hands-on experience, right? So I think we need to really think about how are we providing all the experiences that's necessary for our teachers to be successful.
And to that point, the other thing that I forgot that I was going to say is it is a lot easier to provide those practical experiences using culturally relevant pedagogy when you are engaging in preparation in partnership with the district. When teacher prep programs and districts are partnering with one another to make sure that they're preparing their teachers for the needs of the local community. They're preparing their teachers to understand the cultural norms of the community in which they might be teaching. So partnerships, intensive partnerships, where, for example, people are being prepared in a public school district and are doing their practicum experiences and their observations in a district that the teacher prep program has really intentionally and carefully worked with to make sure that everything is aligned. That's a real opportunity to help people get engaged experience actually using culturally relevant pedagogy so that it's not just a theory, it's a praxis.
Oh, thank you for that really thoughtful response. Hopefully that was helpful. The second question that we have sort of posed is regarding the concern that you all have raised about, the quality of training for, for-profit teacher prep programs. what should we measure or study to understand how well these programs work, what rules might be needed to make sure that they meet quality standards? I'm curious for your thoughts on those.
Yes, so I think there are ongoing efforts right now to study how these programs work. But one thing is to look at their curriculum. What is actually in the curriculum? How are they being trained, right? What hands-on experience do they have? How often, are they in classroom? I think it's really, really hard. Teaching is one of the hardest jobs that I think anybody could have. I can tell you from personal experience that in my 7 years of teaching, that work was a lot more mentally draining and difficult than any time I've ever had in being professor. Being a professor in comparison, it's way
100%.
easier. It is way easier
Yes.
than being a teacher, right? So we really have to think about like, hey, what kind of training do they have? How the support do they have before and after they come into the profession? And then in terms of like measuring that, I think we should measure two main ways. One is what is their mobility? Like how often do those folks who get, certification from an online programs, how often do they actually become a teacher? Or are these, there to essentially take money, predatory, right? To take money from these folks who are often people of color, from marginalized population, and they don't actually become teachers. And then just once they're in the school system, when they're teachers, how often do they stay? It is a 1 or 2 year and done, or are they there for 5, 10 years? Right. And the second piece is then what are the effects that they have on students? And arguably, that's the most important question, right? Is how are they affecting students? And preliminary evidence suggests that they're not serving students well, right? So then if they are coming in for just a year or two, and maybe a third of them, maybe 40 of them, percent of them stay, they're not serving students well, then it raises some serious questions about what are these programs doing to the profession, but also to our students. So we have to think about what are the standards that must be in place, right? It's not always necessarily, about test scores, about entrance exam scores for teachers. It's really about what kind of programming are we providing for teachers, what kind of supports are we giving them, and then how are we ensuring that their needs are being met.
And just on that, I know that there's a lot of talk in, Washington about, whether for-profit schools are, to your point, sort of the best bang for your buck if you're getting that return on investment. And I know they're looking at sort of employment as opposed to necessarily the sector in which they're employed. And so it's an interesting, proposal to make sure that are you actually going to become a teacher as opposed to are you going and getting a job, and is that sort of providing adequate sort of income for you to pay off your student loans versus sort of I think there's been potentially proposals, are you getting licensed or how often do you
Yeah.
pass licensure exams, whether that's teaching, nursing, that kind of thing. And so definitely some interesting policy ideas, but I know we only have 2 minutes left, and so I might throw in one of my own questions. So I think one of the things that we've sort of seen with this administration is that, they have sort of pulled back on some of the teacher prep programs, but I think even as recently as last month, we saw a White House executive order talking about, support for HBCUs, which was exciting. And so I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about, the potential role here for HBCUs, again, historically Black colleges and universities, MSIs. So, I said that and now I'll have to look up exactly what MSIs are, but
Minority serving
HBCUs.
institutions, right?
Yes, minority serving institutions, some of those that are recognized at, educating more broadly, not just in the teaching professions, but more marginalized groups. And I'm wondering if you can talk about their role in potentially contributing to more special education teachers of color.
Yeah, historically, a lot of HBCUs were powerhouses in preparing teachers, including special education teachers. And there was a lot of investment in the last 4 years in supporting those teacher preparation programs. So, for example, the Office of Special Education Programs, every year they fund personnel prep grants, both at the teacher level and at the faculty level. So they will fund folks to get their PhD, for example. And in the last couple of years, they have either required or incentivized folks to partner with HBCUs or MSIs in preparing folks, which was fantastic. So it allowed for greater investment. And they realized that over time they were actually underinvesting in MSIs, and they decided they wanted to change that. And so it allowed for more teachers to be prepared in these programs that were built to be culturally relevant.
And it looks like that's all the time that we'll have. So I just want to say thank you both, Dr. Bettini and Dr. Nguyen, for spending some time to talk about your great research and sharing that with folks. And for anyone tuning in, thank you for tuning in. And for any teachers out there, thank you for all the work that you do. We know that it's very underappreciated. And so just thank you from all of us here at BU.
Thank
Thanks
you
so much,
so
Jessica.
much.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.